Beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Vanderbilt Ball, where power and wealth parade behind jeweled masks, one timid waitress dares to step into the light. Her voice, trembling yet true, paints the ballroom with such vivid beauty that it silences the elite and awakens a blind girl's laughter. But what begins as a simple act of kindness soon ignites a scandal that could destroy reputations, unravel secrets, and test the limits of love and courage. Tonight, we invite you into a story of forbidden desire, of whispers sharper than knives, and of a woman's struggle to be seen in a world designed to silence her. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and above all, do you believe true love can survive society's cruelest gaze? New York City, winter of 1883. The city shone beneath a pale sky, its gas lamps flickering like trembling stars against the snow-dusted avenues. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, their wheels spraying slush onto the boots of vendors who hurried to pack their stalls before dusk. At the corner of Fifth Avenue, a line of liveried footmen stood like statues before a mansion so vast it seemed to swallow the street. The Vanderbilt residence, heart of the season's most dazzling ball. Within its walls, every mirror was polished to a sheen like water, and every crystal drop of the chandeliers trembled with the promise of whispered intrigues. In a cramped boarding house on the Lower East Side, Susie Walton tightened the laces of her worn boots with trembling fingers. The invitation had not been hers, but the agency's. She had been chosen for her quiet demeanor and steady hands to serve the elite for one evening only. The small tin locket at her neck pressed coldly against her skin, a silent reminder of the mother she had lost and the life she had never known. Her dark navy dress, simple and high-necked, bore the faint scent of starch. Over it, she tied a fresh white linen apron, the only shield between herself and a world that would never claim her as its own. The journey to the mansion seemed to stretch endlessly. The cab smelled of damp wool and smoke, and the horses' hooves clattered like a warning against the frozen street. Susie's breath clouded the small window as she stared at the blur of wealth passing by. Carriages with gold crests, ladies cloaked in velvet and fur, gentlemen stepping lightly onto marble steps. Her hands, calloused but graceful, folded tightly in her lap. She whispered a prayer she had not said since girlhood, not for luck, but for invisibility. Inside the Vanderbilt mansion, light poured from every window like molten gold. Servants moved in disciplined lines, their voices low, their eyes lowered. Susie stepped through the servants' entrance, her boots slipping slightly on polished stone. The air smelled of beeswax, roses, and roasting quail from the kitchens below. She followed a butler's clipped instructions up the back staircase and emerged into a hallway where portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down as if to measure her worth. Beyond the double doors, music swelled, violins, cellos, and a waltz slow enough to catch the sigh of every lady's gown. She glimpsed the ballroom through a crack in the door, an ocean of silk, pearls, and peacock feathers, of gentlemen in black tailcoats and ladies in shimmering gowns of gold and ivory. Her heart beat so hard it seemed to echo in her ears. She adjusted the ribbon at her bun and forced her hands to still. Tonight, she would be no one, only a shadow with a tray, a voice that would never be heard. Across the ballroom, another carriage had arrived moments earlier. Harrison Chamberlain, tall and severe in his black tailcoat and ivory waistcoat, stood at the threshold with his daughter Clementine. His gloved hand rested lightly on her arm as she tilted her head, listening to the music she could not see. Her pale blue eyes, unfocused but luminous, reflected the crystal light above. He guided her forward with a measured step, his gaze scanning the crowd with the practiced caution of a man who trusted no one. Whispers followed them as they entered, whispers of fortunes made in iron and banking, of a wife buried 5 winters ago, of a daughter whose blindness was both tragedy and mystery. Harrison's jaw was set, his silver-streaked hair perfectly combed back, Yet beneath his restraint pulsed a loneliness he had no words for. The ballroom parted around him, like water around a ship's prow. Every glance cast not at his wealth, but at the aura of power that clung to him. Susie's tray trembled as she passed through the glittering crowd, balancing crystal flutes of champagne. The scent of perfume and warm silk pressed around her like a suffocating curtain. She kept her eyes lowered, but in the reflection of a gilded mirror, she caught a glimpse of the magnate and his daughter. The girl's small gloved hand gripped her father's arm with trust. Susie's chest tightened with a pang she could not name, a yearning so quiet it felt like a secret. In that moment, separated by marble columns and invisible walls of class, two worlds existed within the same room. One glittered with chandeliers and power, the other trembled with hidden dignity. Susie adjusted her tray, inhaled slowly, and stepped forward into the music and murmurs of the ballroom, unaware that a single evening was about to draw her name, her voice, and her heart into a story none of them could have imagined. The ballroom pulsed like a living heart, golden and warm, glittering with candlelight that spilled from hundreds of crystal chandeliers. The scent of beeswax, champagne, and gardenia hovered over the polished marble floor, where ladies in silken gowns swept past in waves of color and rustle, their voices trailing like silk ribbons behind them. Everywhere was music, soaring violins, murmuring cellos, and the deep, steady beat of a grand piano, all echoing beneath the domed ceiling frescoed with angels and constellations. Susie Walton moved quietly through this ocean of splendor, her fingers trembling just slightly on the silver tray she carried. Her steps were light, but her senses sharp, catching the faintest rustle of layered skirts, the glint of gold on cufflinks, the laughter that rose and fell like a tide. She was one of many maids tonight, indistinguishable in her plain navy dress and pressed white apron. And yet, beneath her calm exterior, her heart beat with a strange mixture of awe and dread. This was not her world, it never had been. But for this one night she was permitted to breathe its air, to glimpse its rituals from behind lowered lashes. She walked past rows of guests who did not see her, their eyes fixed on champagne flutes, silk fans, and the unspoken drama that shimmered beneath each carefully chosen word. As she circled the room for the third time, a gentle tug on her skirt made her pause. She turned, startled, to find a girl of about 13 standing near one of the tall windows, her pale hands folded neatly before her, her golden hair curled and tied with a lavender ribbon. Her eyes, soft and blue, though unfocused, gazed past Susie, fixed on a world she could no longer see. "Excuse me," the girl said softly. Her voice was high, almost fragile. "May I ask you something?" Susie set the tray against her hip, curtsied out of instinct, and offered a smile. "Of course, miss." The girl tilted her head slightly. "I can hear the music and feel the warmth of the candles, but I wonder, could you tell me what it looks like in here?" For a moment Susie hesitated. Her throat tightened, and her gaze flicked to the clusters of guests nearby. No one had noticed. Yet, she looked back at the girl's hopeful face and felt her resolve melt. "Very well," Susie said in a hushed tone. "If it pleases you." She knelt just slightly, lowering her voice, drawing closer to the girl's ear. "There are chandeliers above us, like floating stars. Each one is a bouquet of crystal, holding candles that flicker in every direction. Their light dances across the mirrors on the walls, huge mirrors, framed in gold, and the reflections make it seem as though the room stretches forever." Clementine Chamberlain, for that was her name, inhaled softly, and the corners of her lips lifted in a faint smile. "Go on," she whispered. Susie glanced around. A few heads had turned. A pair of matrons watched with idle curiosity from behind feathered fans. She continued anyway. "The floor is marble, polished so fine it reflects the skirts of the ladies as they pass. They're wearing gowns of every color, emerald, sapphire, rose, ivory, each embroidered with gold thread or tiny seed pearls. Some wear feathers in their hair, others tiaras that glitter like frost. The gentlemen are in black coats and white gloves. Their shoes shine like glass. Clementine's breath caught. And the ceiling? It's painted with clouds and stars. Cherubs and angels drift above us, reaching for one another with outstretched arms. You can almost imagine they'll come to life when the clock strikes midnight. For several seconds, the girl said nothing. She stood in stillness, her lashes trembling. Then, as the orchestra swelled into a gentle waltz, she laughed, lightly, clearly, with the abandon of a child discovering joy. That laugh cut through the ballroom like a wind chime in a storm. Conversations paused. A few guests turned to see where the sound had come from, but none were more affected than Harrison Chamberlain. Across the room, he had stood near the hearth, locked in an obligatory conversation with a state senator. The moment he heard his daughter's voice rise in laughter, a sound he had not heard in 5 years, he stopped mid-sentence. His head turned sharply, his eyes narrowing on the spot where Clementine stood, and there beside her was a young woman in a maid's uniform, kneeling, speaking, with a tenderness that transcended the polished etiquette of the ballroom. He moved toward them slowly, weaving through the crowd without haste, but with precise intent. As he approached, he caught only the tail end of Susie's words. And the candlelight makes everything golden, like stepping into a dream you don't want to wake from. Clementine was beaming. "You have a beautiful voice," she said. Susie flushed, rising quickly as she realized someone stood behind her. She turned and looked directly into the eyes of Harrison Chamberlain. He was taller than she expected, with a presence that made her breath catch. His face was striking, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, graying temples, and yet it was his eyes that unsettled her. Steel grey, deeply set, and unreadable. He studied her, not unkindly, but with a gravity that made the room fall away. "My daughter seems very taken with you," he said at last, his voice low and perfectly modulated. Susie dropped into a curtsy so swiftly the tray in her hand nearly tilted. "Forgive me, sir, I didn't mean to overstep. She asked, and I—" He raised a hand. "There is no fault." He looked to Clementine. "You laughed, my dear." The girl nodded. "She made me see it, Papa." With her words, I felt as though I were dancing in the light. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Harrison's expression. A memory, perhaps, or pain. He turned back to Susie. "What is your name?" "Susie, sir. Susie Walton." He nodded once, then looked again to his daughter. "Would you like her to remain near you this evening?" Clementine's answer was immediate. "Yes, please." Susie's heart twisted. This was not what she had come here for. She was to serve drinks, not linger with the guests. And yet the child's face, so open, so full of newfound joy, left her unable to refuse. "If the hostess permits it," she murmured. "She will," Harrison replied. And just like that, the matter was settled. He stepped away without another word, but not before his eyes met Susie's once more. Something passed between them, not warmth, not yet, but awareness. Recognition, perhaps, that for a moment something unexpected had stirred the still waters of their lives. Susie remained near Clementine for the remainder of the set, speaking only when asked, watching the room from a new vantage point. The tray in her hands grew heavy, but she barely noticed. Around them, society flowed like wine in a goblet, bright, effervescent, and ready to spill. But within the small circle they occupied, lit by the candlelight's glow and held in a fragile thread of kindness, there was quiet. And in that quiet, a seed was planted. A voice had been heard. A heart had stirred. And though Susie did not yet know it, she had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. The chandeliers sparkled more brightly as the evening wore on, casting prisms of light across the gilded cornices and alabaster columns of the ballroom. Each passing hour deepened the opulence, as if the night itself were determined to outshine the last. The orchestra played with growing fervor. the tempo of the music now matching the pulse of the guests, whose champagne-filled laughter masked the undercurrent of rivalry and speculation. Whispers moved faster than the dancers, in corners veiled by lace curtains, on stairwells lined with gold banisters, behind the fluttering fans of debutantes too young to understand discretion. The question rippled like perfume through the crowd. Who was she? The maid with the soft voice. The girl who knelt beside the blind Chamberlain girl and made her smile as no one had in years. The one who dared to speak, gracefully, poetically, but still dared to speak. From the west corner of the ballroom, beneath a balcony draped in imported velvet, Mrs. Lavinia Westbury observed everything. Nothing escaped her gaze. Wrapped in black velvet and crowned with ostrich feathers, she resembled a vulture dressed for the opera. Her lorgnette trembled ever so slightly in her gloved hand, not from age, but from indignation barely contained. She watched as Harrison Chamberlain stood once more beside the maid. The waitress, she reminded herself, speaking in a voice too low to carry, while the child Clementine leaned lightly on Susie Walton's arm. It was indecent, it was irregular, it was dangerous. Mrs. Westbury clicked her fan shut with a snap that made two nearby ladies startle. "This is precisely why one must guard one's invitations," she muttered. "Let one stray thread enter the weave, and the entire tapestry unravels." With that, she descended. Susie, unaware of the approaching storm, stood at Clementine's side, her tray now empty and held awkwardly at her waist. Her eyes were cast modestly downward, but her ears could not ignore the hushed tones curling around her like smoke. Her heart beat not with pride, but with quiet alarm. She had not meant to become visible. She had not meant to disturb the surface of such a carefully polished world. Clementine was speaking softly about the sound of the violins, and asking if Susie thought the curtains felt as heavy as they looked. Susie smiled and opened her mouth to answer. "Miss Walton?" A voice like a blade cut through the warmth. Susie turned and curtsied at once. Mrs. Westbury stood before her, towering, her expression frozen in a tight display of civility stretched over fury. "You will come with me now." Clementine's hand tightened on Susie's arm. "She was only helping me." "Dear child," Mrs. Westbury interrupted, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "I'm certain she meant well, but it is not a servant's place to consort with the guests beyond her duties. I'm sure you understand. Mr. Chamberlain would expect nothing less." "I am Mr. Chamberlain," came a calm voice behind her. The silence was immediate. Harrison stood only a few steps away, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. Guests nearby fell into quiet postures of pretend distraction, listening without seeming to listen. Mrs. Westbury straightened. "Of course, I meant no offence, sir. I simply thought—" "You thought to discipline one of the serving staff at my daughter's side without consulting me," he said evenly. "That was thoughtful indeed." A hint of colour rose to her powdered cheeks. Harrison turned to Susie, his tone shifting. "Miss Walton, has anyone expressed to you that your presence with Clementine is inappropriate?" Susie hesitated. "No, sir." "Then I would ask you to continue at her side. My daughter trusts few people." Mrs. Westbury smiled tightly. "Naturally, if that is your wish, then I thank you for your concern," Harrison cut in, "but I believe the matter is resolved." With a graceful bow of his head, he dismissed the hostess. Mrs. Westbury, checkmated in her own ballroom, turned with her skirts rustling like warning bells and walked away. Susie stood still, unsure of what had just happened. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and her cheeks burned with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Harrison's gaze returned to her. "Are you all right, Miss Walton?" "Yes," she said quietly. "Thank you." He studied her for a moment. The lines around his mouth were drawn, but his eyes had softened. There was something else, too, something in the way his gaze did not drift as quickly as it should have, in the way his presence did not retreat as fast as propriety would demand. "Clementine is very fond of you already," he said. "She responds to gentleness." "I'm honored," Susie murmured. He gave a single nod, then stepped back, as if reminded of his station. "Carry on." And with that, he was gone. The rest of the night unfolded like a dream blurred by candlelight. Clementine asked Susie to describe more of the room, but this time the girl was not content with mere shapes or colors. She asked about the way people moved, how their laughter sounded, if they looked sincere or painted in joy. Susie answered as best she could, careful with her words, tender with her truth. Every so often she felt eyes on her. Sometimes it was the gaze of curious guests. Sometimes it was the sting of judgment. But once, near the close of the final waltz, she turned toward the balcony and found Harrison watching her. He stood alone, half in shadow, his expression unreadable, his posture still. Their eyes met only briefly, yet in that fraction of time, something passed between them. Not a smile, not a word, just a silence heavy with meaning, a breath held too long, a pause that spoke louder than conversation. Then he turned, and the moment was gone. Susie lowered her gaze, her hands tightening on the tray that had grown heavy with the night. She reminded herself that she was a servant, and he was a king in a city of kings. Whatever flickered in his gaze was nothing more than curiosity, nothing more than a passing thought in a mind far removed from hers. And yet, as the guests began to disperse and the music faded into the hush of night, Susie remained still for a moment longer, near the window where she had first knelt beside a blind girl and spoken of chandeliers. Outside, snow was falling, gentle, white, and slow. Inside, something else had begun to fall, a wall, a silence, a certainty. And in the quiet that followed, a gaze across the divide lingered like a note not yet resolved. The morning after the ball arrived, dressed in frost. New York City, blanketed in a pale hush of snow, awoke slowly, as though the entire metropolis had lingered in dreams, too grand to release. Chimneys exhaled soft plumes of smoke into the brittle air, and the windows of the wealthy fogged gently behind heavy curtains. In the modest boarding house where Susie Walton lived, the cold crept in through every wooden seam. Her hands, red from washing the same dress she had worn the night before, trembled slightly as she wrung the fabric and laid it flat to dry. Sleep had been shallow, interrupted by images she dared not name. Flickers of candlelight on gold, the hush of an entire ballroom listening, and the way his eyes had lingered, quiet and full of questions. She had thought the memory would fade with daylight, but the knock at the door changed everything. It came just after 9 o'clock. A boy in livery, no older than 14, stood on the doorstep with flushed cheeks and a wax-sealed envelope. He did not wait for a reply. Susie broke the seal with nervous fingers. Inside, on heavy cream stationery, were words written in a careful, formal hand. "Miss Walton, Mr. Chamberlain requests your presence at his residence this morning at your earliest convenience. Carriage to arrive within the hour. Cordially, Ambrose Harlan's secretary to Mr. H. Chamberlain." She read the note twice, her heart pounding louder with each line. The paper trembled in her grasp. Never in her life had she been summoned. She had been dismissed, overlooked, ignored, but never summoned. The carriage arrived as promised. Black, polished, drawn by 2 grey horses, it stood out like a foreign emblem on the humble street. Susie wrapped herself in her threadbare shawl and stepped into it with the eyes of 3 neighbours watching from behind lace curtains. She kept her gaze low as the door closed and the wheels began to roll. The ride to the Chamberlain estate passed in tense silence. Snow fell softly outside, covering the rooftops and sidewalks in purity the city did not deserve. As the carriage turned onto Fifth Avenue and approached the grand home with its towering columns and wrought iron gates, Susie felt her breath catch. She had seen it only once before, from the servants' entrance. Now the front door loomed ahead, carved mahogany adorned with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. She was received by a stern-faced butler, who said nothing beyond, "This way." Inside, the mansion was silent, not with emptiness, but with wealth's peculiar hush, the kind that cloaked rooms in carpets so thick footsteps vanished, and walls so high voices dared not rise above a whisper. The hall smelled of lemon polish and roses. Oil paintings of long-dead ancestors watched her as she passed. She was led to a sitting room at the back of the house. Its windows overlooked a frozen garden, where once, she imagined, roses had bloomed. The fireplace crackled softly. The furniture was deep green velvet, and the clock on the mantel ticked with perfect indifference. Then the door opened. Harrison Chamberlain entered without ceremony. He wore a dark morning coat, unbuttoned, and a charcoal waistcoat over a crisp white shirt. A gold watch chain glinted across his chest. His hair, brushed back, revealed the silver at his temples. He did not smile, but his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, held a quiet intensity that made the air shift. "Miss Walton," he said, voice low and even, "thank you for coming." She rose at once, her hands clasped before her. "Sir, please, sit." She obeyed, perched lightly on the edge of the settee. Her heart thudded beneath her bodice, but her face remained composed. "I'll be brief," he said, standing near the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel. "My daughter has spoken of you with warmth. That alone is rare. Clementine is reserved, but something in your presence eased her." Susie said nothing, unsure if agreement would seem vain or denial dishonest. "I would like to offer you temporary employment," he continued, "not as a servant in this household, but as Clementine's companion and reader. She requires someone with patience, someone who can speak gently and listen carefully." The words hung in the air like smoke. After a pause, he added, "It would require discretion, absolute discretion. My household is watched closely by those eager to speak ill of me, and by extension of my daughter. You must be aware that your presence here may not be welcome by all." She looked up at him then, eyes wide but clear. "I understand, sir. You would live here," he said, "room and board included. Your wage would be fair." "It is not charity, Miss Walton. It is a role of trust." Susie's breath trembled. The offer was more than she had ever imagined. But behind the honor lurked something else, something sharp-edged. "You understand that society will ask questions," he added quietly. "Questions I will not dignify with answers." She nodded, the weight of the moment pressing upon her like velvet and stone. "Yes," she said, "I accept." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through his expression. Relief? Approval? She could not say. "Good." He turned as if the conversation were complete, but then paused. "Do you have any conditions, Miss Walton?" The question startled her. She looked at him fully then, not as a magnate, not as a figure carved in marble, but as a man standing in his own home, asking her opinion. "Yes," she said softly, "only one." He waited. "That Clementine never feels she's a burden." His eyes narrowed slightly. Then, with the faintest nod, he replied, "She won't." Later, as she was shown to her new room on the second floor, a modest chamber overlooking the side garden, Susie felt the eyes of the house fall upon her. The maid who carried her things did so with brisk, silent judgment. The older housekeeper barely concealed her disapproval. 2 footmen whispered as they passed her in the hall. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer anonymous. And for the first time in her life, that terrified her. Alone at last, she stood by the window, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Snow still fell outside, soft as secrets. Somewhere below, the household moved on with its rituals, its silks and china and shadows. She looked down at her hands, steady now, and pressed her palm against the glass. She had stepped through a door that would not open again, and beyond it lay a world that would test not her strength of body, but of soul. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, for all its majesty, breathed in silence. Its walls were thick with secrets, and its velvet drapes muffled more than sound. They veiled glances, ambitions, and quiet aches. Winter deepened beyond its windows, painting the panes with icy lace each morning, while within, the hearths crackled and the air grew warmer, not with joy, but with unspoken tensions. Susie moved through the halls like a shadow of light. No longer a guest, not quite a servant, she existed in a liminal space, neither upstairs nor down. Yet Clementine had claimed her with innocent conviction. Each morning, the girl awaited her with books opened on her lap, her delicate hands resting on embossed pages she could no longer read, her expression blooming the moment she heard Susie's steps on the staircase. The rhythm of their days became a delicate dance. In the mornings, Susie read poetry aloud. Tennyson, Longfellow, Whittier, her voice soft but sure, her pacing measured to match Clementine's breathing. In the afternoons, they sat in the conservatory, where the sunlight filtered through frosted glass and turned Clementine's golden curls to spun silk. Sometimes they spoke of books, sometimes of dreams, and sometimes they said nothing at all. It was in those silences that Susie most felt the presence of Harrison Chamberlain. He never interrupted. He rarely spoke to her directly unless necessary, but he watched, from the doorway, from the second-floor gallery, from the far end of the library. There was nothing menacing in his gaze, only a deep, unreadable intensity. She felt it without needing to look, like the awareness of warmth on the skin before the fire is even lit. One afternoon, while Clementine dozed beside her with her hand curled around Susie's fingers, Susie looked up and saw him standing in the conservatory archway. The light painted his face in fragments, one eye in shadow, the other bright. He didn't move. He only watched them for a moment that stretched far too long. When she met his gaze, he did not look away. It was the first time her heart betrayed her, not with fear, not with confusion, but with a sudden aching pull she had no name for. Later that evening, Susie found herself alone in the stairwell that led to the east wing. The hour was late, and the household was settling into its usual quiet. She had left Clementine peacefully asleep, tucked beneath quilts in her warm chamber. Her own room felt cold and restless, so she walked, hoping the motion would settle her thoughts. The stairwell was lit only by wall sconces, their flames flickering gently, casting moving shadows on the silk-lined walls. The banister beneath her hand was carved mahogany, polished smooth by time and touch. She descended slowly, the hem of her dress whispering against each step. And then she heard them. Two voices, low, hissing, female, from the landing just below. Curious, she froze, retreating into the shadows beside a tall urn. The voices sharpened with tension. "I warned Lavinia this would happen. The girl is dangerous. She's a maid, nothing more." "She is not nothing," hissed the first voice. "She has the child's ear, and now I hear she walks the halls freely, as if she belonged. That's not her doing. That's Chamberlain's indulgence. And that is precisely the point." He notices her. A pause, then dryly, "You mean to say he desires her?" A long silence followed. Then, "He has not looked at a woman since his wife's death, not once, but I saw it with my own eyes. At the ball, and again in the library last week. She must be removed." "She will be." The steps of silk moved away, heels clicking like whispers of judgment, trailing the stench of perfume and poison. Susie did not move until the house was silent again. She stood in the shadows for what felt like hours, her heart pounding, her palms damp. The voices had been unmistakable. Mrs. Westbury and, though the other had remained hidden from her view, surely one of the matrons who lunched regularly at the house. The kind who wore brooches shaped like daggers and praised you only to twist the knife. So it was true. She was not merely disapproved of. She was a threat. Back in her room, Susie sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The candle on her dresser flickered, throwing soft light on the worn tin locket she had placed beside it. She reached for it and opened it gently. Inside, the tiny portrait of her mother smiled faintly, the painted eyes full of softness and sadness. Beside the image was a small scrap of paper, creased and yellowing. A note her mother had written long ago, its ink faded, but the words intact. "You will be seen one day, and when you are, let them see your strength." Susie closed the locket with trembling fingers. She was being seen now, but not as her mother had dreamed. She was being measured, judged, whispered about behind silk gloves and velvet drapes, and worse still, she was beginning to feel. The seed planted in the hush of the ballroom had grown into something fragile and dangerous. She felt it when she passed Harrison in the hallway, and he inclined his head with subtle acknowledgement. She felt it when he paused at the threshold of the conservatory, as if reluctant to enter her presence fully. And she felt it in herself, in the heat that flushed her skin when he came near, in the way her breath caught when his voice, low and steady, filled the air around her. She had not come here to fall into anyone's gaze. She had not come to be anything more than a voice, a comfort to a child. And yet now her every step was watched, her every kindness twisted, her every silence interpreted. She was a guest in a war she had not chosen, and Harrison Chamberlain, he remained distant, proper, but there were moments when his eyes flickered with something unspoken, moments when his hands, gloved or bare, paused too long on the edge of a door, as if wishing he could reach for something he had long denied himself. That night, as the mansion slept beneath its silken silence, Susie stood by the window of her room and watched the snow begin again. The flakes fell gently, like blessings or warnings, depending on how one chose to see them. She thought of Clementine's laugh, of the sound of his footsteps behind her, of the venom in Mrs. Westbury's voice. And she knew that winter had only begun. The winter storm arrived without warning, a dense curtain of white sweeping across the city as dusk settled. By late afternoon, the Chamberlain mansion had become an island in a sea of snow. Carriages were turned back, servants whispered about blocked streets, and the sound of the wind rattling against the window panes rose like a restless spirit circling the grand house. Inside, the gaslights glowed softer than usual, their flames bending under each gust that crept through the shutters. Susie had not planned to stay beyond twilight. Her small room at the top of the servants' wing was temporary, a convenience between lessons with Clementine, but as the storm grew heavier, the butler appeared with a stiff nod to inform her that all roads were closed. No one would leave tonight. She thanked him quietly and closed the door, her heart unsteady. It was one thing to walk the house in daylight under the shelter of routine. It was another to be here after dark, when the corridors lengthened and every creak of the wooden floorboards sounded like a whispered secret. She spent the first hours of evening with Clementine, reading softly, while the girl nestled under a thick quilt in her room. The snow tapped steadily at the glass as Susie's voice filled the chamber. The poetry she read felt heavier tonight, the verses of lost kingdoms and waiting hearts echoing her own thoughts more than she wished. When Clementine drifted to sleep, her head turned toward the sound of Susie's voice. Susie rose gently and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. For a moment she lingered there, smoothing a curl of golden hair from the child's forehead. She left the room slowly, closing the door with care, and descended the staircase into the glow of the drawing room. The house seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere down the corridor, she heard the faint clink of glasses, the low murmur of a man's voice speaking to himself. She hesitated at the threshold of the drawing room. Harrison Chamberlain stood by the fire. He was alone, his tall frame outlined by the glow of flames that flickered across the carved marble mantel. He had removed his coat, and his waistcoat lay open, revealing the crisp linen of his shirt. In his hand, he held a glass of brandy, untouched. His posture was rigid, but not rehearsed. It was the stance of a man trying to master his own memories. When he looked up and saw her, his expression did not harden as she expected. Instead, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as though her presence were neither intrusion nor surprise. "The storm will not break tonight," he said quietly. You should be comfortable enough here until morning." "Thank you, sir," she murmured, her fingers clasped together. The fire's glow stretched toward her, and yet the room felt strangely cold. He gestured faintly toward the armchair opposite his. "Sit, Miss Walton. The house is quieter than usual. My daughter sleeps, and I am not fond of my own company." She hesitated, then crossed the room. The carpet muffled her steps, and the scent of leather and old wood rose as she settled into the armchair. For a moment they said nothing. The wind moaned against the shutters, and the fire cracked softly. Harrison stared into the flames. His profile was sharp, the grey at his temples catching the light like frost. At last he spoke. "My wife hated this room," he said. "She called it a mausoleum. I thought it dignified." Susie glanced at him. His voice was low, almost distant, as though he were speaking not to her but to the shadows on the wall. She hated the house, in truth, hated the life that came with it. When Clementine fell ill, she said it was this city's fault. The cold, the coal smoke, the endless demands. She never forgave me for keeping us here. He took a slow breath, the sound heavy in the quiet. And when the fever came, when our daughter's sight dimmed and then vanished, she turned her face from both of us. Even in death she seemed to reproach me. I built an empire, and still I could not give her what she wanted. The words lingered like ash above the fire. Susie felt her throat tighten. She had never heard him speak more than a handful of words at once, never seen the mask shift from his features. Now it cracked, and beneath it lay not power, but grief, etched deep like an old scar. "I am sorry," she said softly. "No child deserves such illness. No father deserves to feel helpless." He turned his gaze to her then, and for a moment she felt the weight of his eyes fully. Grey, yes, but not cold. They were storm clouds holding back rain. "You speak as though you know," he murmured. She lowered her eyes to her hands. "Loss wears the same face everywhere, sir. My parents died when I was very young. I was raised by an aunt who worked herself to exhaustion to keep a roof over us. She passed last year. Since then, I have not belonged anywhere." The admission surprised even her. She had not meant to share so much. Yet the warmth of the fire, the hush of the storm, the rare softness in his voice, they drew the words from her like water rising from a hidden spring. "I thought," she continued quietly, "if I could be of use, if I could earn my keep, it would be enough. And yet here, with Clementine, for the first time, I feel something else. I feel as though I am seen." Silence settled between them again, deeper this time, not uncomfortable but fragile. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks upward. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest. Harrison set his glass down, untouched, and leaned forward slightly. "You have given my daughter more than any tutor or physician." She laughs again. "Do you know how rare that is?" Susie shook her head faintly. "I only speak to her." "You see her," he corrected. "You do not pity her. You speak as if her blindness is not an absence but a space that can be filled with words." His hand rested briefly on the arm of his chair, fingers flexing as though reaching for something and stopping just short. She looked at him then, truly looked, and felt the pull again, stronger, deeper. In that quiet room, with the storm sealing them in, the boundary between magnate and maid felt like a thin pane of glass ready to crack. But before she could find words, the door opened gently. Clementine stood there, barefoot, her lavender nightgown trailing behind her like a whisper. Her pale blue eyes turned toward her father's voice. "Papa?" she murmured. Harrison rose at once. "What is it, my dear?" "I dreamed of the ballroom again," she said softly. "Only this time it was clearer. Miss Walton described it to me so well that I could almost see it. Better than any debutante ever could, I think." Harrison glanced at Susie, something flickering in his expression. Clementine smiled sleepily and added, "She makes everything beautiful." The girl yawned, and Harrison guided her gently back toward the door, his large hand resting lightly against her small shoulder. Susie rose, uncertain, her heart hammering. "I will take her back to bed," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. The firelight caught his face, casting one side in gold, the other in shadow. His gaze lingered, not with authority, but with something searching, almost hesitant. For the first time, Susie felt it fully. He was seeing her, not as a servant, not as an interloper, but as a woman standing at the edge of his world. And though no word was spoken, the moment burned as brightly as the fire between them. A portrait in candlelight neither would forget. The sun shone deceptively warm on the day of the luncheon, filtering through the bare branches of Central Park and gilding the city in fragile light. The Chamberlain residence, nestled behind its stone walls and towering wrought-iron gates, stood as always, a fortress of marble, tradition, and measured silence. Yet that morning it bristled with activity. Fresh flowers from the conservatory adorned every table in the eastern salon. Crystal decanters reflected tiny rainbows across linen tablecloths, and delicate porcelain gleamed with gold accents. It was Mrs. Lavinia Westbury's doing, of course, a gathering of select ladies from the city's oldest families, veiled as a charitable committee, but, in truth, nothing more than a gilded tribunal. And Susie Walton, under the naive encouragement of Clementine, had accepted an invitation extended with poisoned courtesy. "You must come," Clementine had pleaded. "They'll like you once they speak with you. They only need to see how kind you are." Susie, touched by the girl's trust and unaware of the snare laid beneath it, had allowed herself to hope. The moment she entered the salon, however, she felt it. The air thinned by perfume and expectation. The brittle smiles stretched over tight faces. The way conversations halted the instant she crossed the threshold. Dressed in her plainest day dress, a soft dove-grey wool with a high collar and no adornment, she clutched her gloves in trembling hands. Her hair, neatly pinned, felt too simple, her presence too visible. Mrs. Westbury, in garnet silk and jet beads, rose to greet her with the practiced grace of a seasoned predator. "Miss Walton," she said sweetly, "how kind of you to join us." Susie curtsied softly. "Thank you for the invitation, madam." The other ladies, 4 in total, all wives or widows of men with fortunes entangled in Chamberlain contracts, nodded in cold politeness, their eyes sliding over Susie as one might assess an unexpected insect on the hem of an expensive gown. The tea began with banalities: weather, concerts, a new shipment of French lace. Yet even as the silver spoons clinked and laughter chimed falsely over china cups, Susie felt the tension coil tighter, like a bowstring waiting for release. It came, as always, from Mrs. Westbury. "And tell us, Miss Walton," she said, buttering a biscuit with the deliberation of a woman slicing skin. "Do you find your position here comfortable?" Susie blinked. "I am grateful for the opportunity to assist Miss Clementine. She is a remarkable young lady." "Yes," another lady interjected, her lips pursed. "And her father? Is he as generous with his gratitude?" The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Susie felt the heat rise to her cheeks. "I do not understand the question." Mrs. Westbury leaned forward, her eyes sharp behind the sparkle of her brooch. "It's simply that some among us have observed a closeness, unusual perhaps, between yourself and Mr. Chamberlain." "I assure you," Susie began, her voice shaking, "but there is no need to be defensive," another added with false kindness. "We understand how young women, especially those without connections, must use what gifts they possess." The word struck like a slap. Susie's breath caught. Her gloves dropped to the floor. No one reached to pick them up. "I was invited," she whispered, though she no longer knew if she meant the tea or the house itself. "Of course you were," Mrs. Westbury said, folding her hands with quiet finality. "But invitations, Miss Walton, can be withdrawn." Susie stood. The room tilted, though not from dizziness, but from something deeper, a fracture within. She gathered her gloves with shaking hands, curtsied without a word, and turned to leave. Outside the salon, the hallway felt colder, the walls narrower. Her steps echoed with unbearable clarity. Somewhere above, the sound of Clementine's laughter floated from an open window, pure and trusting. It broke something inside her. She did not stop until she reached her room, and once there, she did not cry. She sat by the window, the same place she had stood on the night of the storm, and stared at the snow-covered trees lining the avenue. She remained there for hours, unmoving, her heart splintered beneath the weight of shame she did not deserve. Downstairs, Harrison Chamberlain arrived late to the aftermath. He found Mrs. Westbury alone in the salon, sipping the last of the tea with a smile too serene. "You had the luncheon," he said evenly. "I did. I heard Miss Walton left early." "Ah, yes. She must not have felt well." His gaze narrowed. "What did you say to her?" Mrs. Westbury raised an arched brow. "Only what others already whisper. I simply offered her clarity. She is, after all, quite young, and quite unprotected." "You will not speak to her again," Harrison said coldly. "Not here, not anywhere." She stood slowly, eyes flashing. "Are you truly prepared to jeopardize your name for a girl who has neither title nor dowry? A girl whose presence in this house is already the subject of mockery? You think the Board of Trustees won't notice? That investors won't whisper?" "I no longer care what they whisper," he said, voice low, "but I will not allow your cruelty to live in my home." He left her there, indignant and alone, and retreated to his study. The fire burned low, casting the room in amber shadow. The door closed behind him with a thud that sounded like resolve. He sat at his desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a fresh sheet of ivory paper. He began to write. "Miss Walton, forgive the silence I allowed to fester. I did not speak when I should have, and in that silence I let others define a narrative that does not belong to them. What I see in you is not impropriety. It is light, dignity, courage where others show artifice. You have restored joy to my daughter's life, and unknowingly you have stirred something in mine that I had long forgotten. Hope. I ask only that you do not leave. Not yet." He paused, fingers tightening around the pen. Then, in a moment, uncharacteristically impulsive, he signed his name, H. Chamberlain. He folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. Wax was melted, a seal pressed. He summoned Ambrose Harlan, his brother-in-law and adviser, who had arrived for a late meeting. The man entered with his usual forced grace, bowing slightly. "Deliver this to Miss Walton," Harrison instructed, "directly to her hand, immediately." "Yes, of course," Ambrose replied smoothly. He accepted the letter, tucked it into his breast pocket, bowed again. But he never reached the stairs. Instead, he slipped into the gentleman's cloakroom near the side of the house. The fire there was low but lit. He took the letter, broke the seal with surgical precision, and read it with a tightening jaw. Then, without hesitation, he dropped the letter into the flames. The edges curled. The ink bled into nothing. Ambrose stood, watching until the paper became ash. He smoothed his lapel, his expression unreadable, and left the room with the silence of a man who had long since learned the weight of self-interest. Upstairs, Susie sat by the window still, waiting, hoping, but the letter never came. The governor's ball was the kind of occasion that made the very city of New York inhale and hold its breath. Invitations were issued on gold-edged vellum, delivered by liveried messengers, and signed by the governor's own hand. The elite gathered like constellations summoned to shine, each star vying to outdazzle the others with diamonds, lineage, and unshakable poise. The Chamberlain name was carved into that sky by legacy alone. It was assumed that Harrison would attend, as always, his presence both a political certainty and a social necessity. What no one assumed, what no one dared to imagine, was that the young, blind daughter of the magnate would refuse to set foot in the ballroom unless Susie Walton stood beside her. The morning of the ball dawned clear and brittle, the snow like sugar over rooftops. Within the Chamberlain mansion, tempers flared behind closed doors. Clementine had risen early, her hair already braided with satin ribbons, and announced her intention with the quiet force of a girl who had learned that blindness did not mean silence. "I will not go without her," she said calmly at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a cup of chocolate she barely touched. "They speak kindly to my face and laugh when I turn. Susie tells me the truth. If I must walk through a room of vipers, let me go with someone who does not wear a mask." Harrison looked at her long and hard. His fork rested against the edge of his plate. Outside the window, the carriage horses were being prepared, their breaths misting the air. "She is not invited," he said quietly. "She is needed," Clementine replied. "By me." Hours later, a carriage pulled up before the modest boarding house where Susie had returned just days prior. The footman held out a letter sealed with the Chamberlain crest. Inside, the note was written in Harrison's own hand. "Come tonight. Not for them. For her. H." Below the message was a simple line. "A gown has been arranged." Susie stared at the paper for a long time. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a wave of feeling too strong to name. She had waited for words that never came, and now, in 3 lines, everything and nothing had been said. The gown arrived minutes later in a box lined with soft lavender tissue. It was not new. It had been worn before, once, perhaps twice, but it was exquisite. Pale blue silk with pearl buttons and delicate lace at the sleeves. Modest, but not plain. When she slipped it over her chemise, it fit almost perfectly. She did not ask how he knew her size. Her hair was gathered simply, pinned in soft waves with a single silver comb. No jewels, no gloves, only the locket around her neck tucked beneath the neckline of the gown, like a secret no one could steal. The governor's mansion stood at the edge of the park, its colonnaded facade glowing in the gaslight. The ballroom inside was a cathedral of excess, vaulted ceilings, cascading chandeliers, and music that seemed to rise from the marble itself. Susie entered through the front, not the servants' door. Her feet, clad in borrowed satin shoes, stepped carefully across the tiled floor, each click a defiance. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air changed. Heads turned, conversations stumbled, fans fluttered with nervous energy. Who was she? Why was she here? And then Clementine, dressed in ivory silk and standing beside her father, turned toward the sound of her steps and smiled. "You came," she said softly, holding out her hand. Susie crossed the room like a breath of wind. She took Clementine's hand and kissed it gently. "I said I would." From a distance, Harrison watched. He had not offered more than the note. He had not seen her since the luncheon. But now, as she stood before him in candlelight and silk, his breath caught. She did not bow. He did not speak. But their eyes met, briefly, fiercely, and in that gaze an entire chapter was written in silence. The music resumed, a waltz. Couples spun across the floor. Clementine leaned into Susie's guidance, laughing as she imagined the gowns swaying, the chandeliers trembling. For a moment, it was as if no one else existed. But society never forgets. And it never forgives a woman who dares to rise without permission. A voice, high and clear, rang across the dance floor. "How charming," it said. "The maid plays the lady." Susie froze. So did Clementine. The voice belonged to Miss Lillian Ashcroft, the daughter of a steel baron and a debutante trained in cruelty from birth. Draped in emerald silk, she glided forward, her chin lifted high. "Tell me, Miss Walton," she continued, her lips curved in mock sweetness, "do you enjoy playing the part? Or is it simply the only role you've yet to soil?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Susie's cheeks burned, her breath hitched. She turned toward the door, but Clementine's hand tightened around hers. "No," Clementine said firmly. "Don't go." Lillian laughed, but it sounded brittle. "It's no secret, you know, that she was a waitress." That she charmed her way into this house, into your father's graces. They say she reads to you, but what else does she offer? Loyalty or ambition?" Susie's heart pounded. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat felt like stone. And then Clementine stepped forward. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "She is my eyes," she said, "and my heart." The room fell utterly silent. Clementine turned her sightless gaze toward the crowd. "She does not speak lies. She does not flatter or plot or pretend. She tells me when I am wrong. She holds my hand when I am afraid. She makes me feel not broken, but whole." She reached for Susie, pulled her close, and raised her chin defiantly. "If anyone here believes that birth defines worth, I suggest they speak to a mirror, because what I see in her, what I feel in her, is more nobility than any title in this room." Susie trembled. She felt the press of Clementine's hand, the heat of every eye upon her, the sting of humiliation transformed into something else, something like grace. Across the room, Harrison's hand curled into a fist. He stepped forward but paused. His daughter had spoken, and no voice, not even his own, could match hers in that moment. The music began again, timidly at first. Lillian retreated, her smile cracked. The matrons turned their heads, and Susie stood in the center of the storm, not broken, not bowed, but held. That night she did not dance, but she remained. And when Harrison's eyes found hers once more, there was no question left to ask, only the ache of what had not been said, and the fire of what could no longer be denied. The snow had not yet melted from the steps of the governor's mansion when the final ripple of Clementine's declaration settled over the ballroom like dust. And in that hush, broken only by the tentative rustle of silks and the reluctant resumption of the orchestra, something ancient in Harrison Chamberlain snapped, not in anger, not in defeat, but in revelation. All his life he had obeyed the rules written in polished ink by men who wore masks more rigid than their collars. He had played the part of the widowed magnate with impeccable composure, kept his name spotless while the world around him whispered and maneuvered. But now, watching his daughter stand with the only person who had seen her beyond her broken eyes, he felt a silence deeper than propriety, a silence that asked to be broken. He crossed the ballroom with slow, deliberate steps, not rushed, not hesitant, the kind of stride that announced something unchangeable was about to be done. All eyes followed him, like the orbit of small stars around a sun they could neither touch nor defy. Susie stood at the center of that light, her hand still wrapped in Clementine's, her eyes lowered, her cheeks flushed not from shame, but from the unbearable burden of being watched. He stopped before them. "Miss Walton," he said, his voice calm but resonant, "my daughter has spoken with more grace and courage than most of the men I've known." Susie lifted her eyes slowly. Her breath was caught, somewhere between disbelief and hope. "Tonight, you were made to feel small," Harrison continued, turning slightly to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across faces that had once held power over him. "But there is nothing small about the heart that walks beside my daughter each day, or the voice that taught her to see the world not through fear, but with wonder." He looked back at her. "I would ask you, not as my daughter's companion, but as a woman of dignity, to remain in this house, not as a servant, but as someone we choose to call family." A silence followed that was almost painful. Then it erupted. It began with gasps, whispers. Fans snapped shut with sharp clicks. A matron in a crimson gown murmured something about disgrace. A man near the punch table dropped his glass, the shatter lost beneath the rising storm of protest. Even Clementine's lips parted in shock. She turned toward her father with both wonder and fear. Susie took a step back, the pulse in her ears deafening. The room spun slightly. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't." Clementine reached for her hand again, but Susie gently pulled away. "Please understand," she whispered. "What you've offered me, it's more than I've ever dreamed. But I won't be a symbol, not for them to tear apart. I won't be someone they tolerate just to speak of behind lace fans and polite smiles. I would rather be forgotten with peace than remembered with scorn. She turned and walked toward the double doors. No one stopped her. Harrison watched her go, his face unreadable. He felt Clementine tug at his sleeve, but his feet refused to move. Only when the great doors closed behind Susie did he finally blink, and the spell broke. That night, the ballroom continued without him. He left early, silent, ignoring the pointed stares, the forced laughter. Clementine said nothing on the ride home, only pressed her head against the carriage wall and wept quietly, her hand still clutching the empty space where Susie's fingers had once been. The following morning, she refused breakfast. By noon, the staff had scoured every nearby boarding house, every room Susie had once called her own. She had vanished. On the second day, Harrison ordered his carriage himself. He dressed without a valet. He walked streets he had not seen in years, spoke with people he would never invite into his parlor. On the third day, he abandoned the carriage and went on foot, snow collecting on his coat, his polished boots soaked through. He moved through alleyways, factories, soup kitchens. He did not know what he was searching for until he found it. It was a narrow tenement on the Lower East Side, hidden behind a row of butcher shops and apothecaries. The hallway smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. He followed a whisper of familiarity up 3 flights of stairs. He found her in a small room with peeling wallpaper and a single iron stove. She knelt beside a frail woman who coughed blood into a rag. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair loose around her shoulders, and a basin of water sat beside her. She did not hear him at first. Only when she reached for the towel and found his hand there instead did she look up. Her breath caught. Her lips parted in surprise. Harrison. She had never spoken his name like that before. He knelt beside her without a word, took the towel, helped her. Together they changed the linens. Together they lit the lamp. When the woman fell asleep, Susie led him into the hallway. "I found her a week ago," she explained quietly. "She was my aunt's neighbor, alone. No one else would come." He said nothing, only watched her, the way her hands moved, the way her eyes held both defiance and fatigue. "You left," he said at last. "And I didn't stop you." She lowered her gaze. "Because you thought I would come back?" "No," he replied, "because I didn't know how to ask you to stay." The silence stretched between them. "I burned for 3 days," he said, "with shame, with regret. I thought I was offering you something noble, but I offered you a place without asking where you truly belonged." She looked up at him then, tears brimming. "I didn't want to belong to your world. I wanted to belong beside you." He stepped closer slowly, as if each inch were sacred ground. His voice, when it came, was low. "I see you, Susie Walton, not as charity, not as curiosity. I see the woman who taught my daughter to dream again. I see the soul who stood in a ballroom of wolves and did not flinch. I see the hands that offer more mercy than I have ever known. And I see the heart I cannot forget." He reached out, not forcefully, not ceremoniously, simply held her hand. "I don't ask you to be part of my world," he said. "I ask you to help me build a new one." She stood very still. And then, in a whisper, "You never sent the letter." His brow furrowed. "What letter?" She searched his face, saw no lie there. Her lips trembled. "Then someone never let it reach me." Something passed between them then. Not anger, not suspicion, only sadness for the time lost. But the snow continued to fall beyond the narrow window, soft and slow. And Harrison Chamberlain, once the most unreachable man in New York, stood in a crumbling hallway and pressed his forehead to the woman who had become his salvation. No chandelier burned above them. No orchestra played. Only 2 hearts, once wounded, now whole, beneath the gilded mask of what they had once been. The last days of winter yielded to an early spring, as if the world itself exhaled the weight of ice and silence. In the heart of New York City, The snow retreated from rooftops, revealing stone facades, soot-kissed and golden. Along the iron gates of the Chamberlain estate, crocuses began to bloom. Tentative, brave, delicate things that had waited too long beneath the frozen ground. Susie stood in the garden she once knew only in passing. It was smaller than the others, hidden between the east wing and the conservatory. The ground was damp but breathing again, and beneath the lattice, climbing roses began their quiet ascent. She had read to Clementine here once, beneath an umbrella while the rain whispered on the leaves. Poetry, melancholy, and soft. Now she stood alone, or so she thought. Footsteps approached, measured, certain, the cadence of a man who had decided long ago that he would no longer walk for anyone but now chose to walk toward someone. She turned before he called her name. Harrison stood there, dressed not in a tailored coat or black formal attire, but in a simple dark suit. There was no cravat, no gloves, just him. His gaze held hers. Nothing wavered. He did not kneel. He did not offer a ring. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded once. The edges were worn, the wax seal broken. "I wrote this for you," he said. "The night of the luncheon." Her hands trembled as she accepted it. The ink had smudged in places, but the words remained. She read them once, and then again. Her eyes burned, not with pain, but with the weight of knowing. "I never received it," she whispered. "I know that now." She looked up. "But you didn't write again." "I didn't know if I had the right." Silence gathered around them like dusk. The trees were still bare, their branches like black veins against the sky. And yet there was something alive in the air. "You don't need to promise me protection," she said softly. "I've lived without it. You don't need to give me a home. I can build one. And I won't wear a name just to earn the right to stand beside you." He stepped closer. "I offer you none of those things," he said. "Not because I don't wish to, but because I know what matters." She held her breath. "I offer you this," he continued, "a life with no lies, no pretending, no cages lined with gold. I offer you mornings where we speak honestly, even when it hurts, even when the world doesn't understand." He reached for her hand, slowly, gently, as if the touch itself was sacred. "I won't give you a title," he said, voice trembling with the weight of emotion, "because I want you to give me your name." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She said nothing for a long time, only let his hand wrap around hers, warm and steady. And then, at last, she answered, not with words, but by stepping into his arms and resting her head against his chest. Later, Clementine wept. She cried not from sorrow, but from joy too large for her small frame. She clutched Susie's hands and pressed her forehead to her shoulder, whispering again and again, "You stayed, you stayed." The wedding was not a spectacle. There were no strings, no governor, no reporters waiting behind velvet ropes. Only a gathering of a few witnesses. Clementine, the housekeeper, who now smiled at Susie without suspicion, and a quiet reverend with kind eyes. And when Susie entered the parlour, her gown the colour of pale ivory, her locket tucked still against her heart, Harrison looked at her not with triumph, but with wonder, as if he had spent his whole life building empires just to understand that all of it meant nothing if she did not walk beside him. Days later, an invitation arrived, embossed in gold. The Vanderbilt estate once again. Susie stared at it for a long time. Harrison said nothing. Clementine, however, placed the envelope in her hands and whispered, "Let them see you." So she went. The ballroom had not changed. The chandeliers still glittered like frozen stars. The walls still echoed with the same laughter, but Susie did not cross the threshold as a maid, nor as an ornament on Harrison Chamberlain's arm. She entered alone, her posture straight, her hair swept up in soft coils, a simple string of pearls around her throat. Every step was a quiet defiance. Every gaze she met without flinching. From the corner of the room, Mrs. Westbury turned pale and looked away. Harrison watched her from a distance, pride hidden beneath restraint. Clementine walked beside her, holding her hand, guiding her through the room, not as a child needing direction, but as a daughter leading a mother. And when the music began, Susie did not dance. She stood beneath the chandelier and looked upward. The lights were no longer blinding. They were stars she had once described to a girl who could not see, and now that same girl stood beside her, glowing with certainty. As the guests murmured and watched, Clementine reached for her again. "Describe it," she said. Susie smiled. "The lights are golden," she whispered, "and they fall like laughter across the marble. The mirrors reflect the past, but tonight they only show what's real." Her voice, once hesitant, now rang like a bell rung for the first time. "And above us, the stars, not painted, not chandeliers, but real stars, the kind we carry inside us when the world finally lets us be seen." Clementine closed her eyes and pressed her cheek to Susie's shoulder. "I see them," she whispered. "I do." And so the story ended, not with applause, not with approval, but with a whisper. The same voice that once described chandeliers now described the stars, and beside her stood a daughter, a husband, and a room that finally saw her not for where she came from, but for the light she never stopped carrying. Spring arrived early that year. The lilacs in the garden behind the Chamberlain home had bloomed before the first day of April, their perfume curling through the open windows and lacing the corridors with memory. New York City, ever-changing and always hungry, pressed on around them, taller buildings, faster carriages, louder voices, but within the gates of the estate on Fifth Avenue, time moved differently, not slower, just deeper. Susie stood by the conservatory arch, a woven shawl around her shoulders despite the warmth. Her hair, now threaded with the faintest strands of silver, was pinned in soft coils at the nape of her neck. She watched the garden come to life again, with the same quiet reverence she had held for it all those years ago, when she'd been nothing more than a voice for a girl who could not see. Now, that girl was a woman. Clementine walked arm in arm with a young man in the orchard beyond the roses. She wore soft blue, her cane tapping gently against the path. Though her sight had never returned, her grace had only grown, sharpened by time, softened by love. The man beside her, Elias, spoke in low tones, pausing when she laughed. He did not guide her. He walked with her. Susie smiled. The screen door creaked open behind her, and a pair of small feet ran across the stone. "Mother!" She turned just in time to catch the boy as he flung himself into her arms. 6 years old, with storm-grey eyes and unruly dark hair, he smelled of sunlight and ink. His name was Julian. "Papa says I can ride with him in the carriage today," he exclaimed. "Did he now?" she asked, brushing a curl from his forehead. "And have you asked your tutor about your lessons?" Julian gave her a mischievous smile, the same smile Harrison had worn the first time he had dared to offer her anything more than silence. "He said I was too clever for arithmetic," the boy replied, matter of fact. "He gave up." She laughed. The sound carried on the wind like birdsong. Harrison appeared at the doorway, older now, his temples silver, his shoulders broader with the weight of years. But his gaze, steady, warm, had not aged. He looked at her the way he always had when no one was watching, as though he still couldn't quite believe she was real. "Your son is terrorizing the staff again," he said mildly. "Our son," she corrected, reaching for his hand. He laced his fingers through hers with familiar ease. 7 years, he murmured, drawing her close. "And you still look at me like I might vanish." She looked up at him. "And you still hold me like I never will." Behind them, the city's skyline rose higher than ever, smokestacks and domes competing for the heavens. But the Chamberlain house had become more than just a home. It had become a beacon. The social circles that once whispered about Susie Walton had long since quieted, some out of shame, others because they were no longer invited anywhere that mattered. Mrs. Westbury, now frail and often absent from society, lived in the shadows of her own pride. Her name no longer commanded fear. She had lost influence, yes, but more than that, she had lost relevance. And as the years passed, more young women without names began to appear at grand events, not as servers or curiosities, but as guests, as wives, as equals. Not all, not many, but enough. Enough to shift the conversation, enough to start a new chapter. One afternoon, Julian asked his mother if she had always lived in such a house. "No," she told him. "Once I lived behind a curtain where no one saw me." "And then Papa found you?" She paused. "No," she said gently. "I found myself, and then he saw me." That evening, Clementine read aloud to the family from a volume of poetry, her voice sure and serene. Julian sat at her feet, drawing stars on parchment, while Harrison watched from the armchair, a book forgotten in his lap. Susie listened to her daughter's voice fill the room. The girl who had once asked her to describe chandeliers now spoke of galaxies and constellations, her words painting light into every corner. As dusk fell, and the stars blinked into the sky beyond the window, Susie stepped outside once more. She tilted her head to the heavens and whispered a verse. Not a prayer, not a memory, but a promise, a whisper. The same voice that had once described chandeliers to a blind girl now described the stars to a son who would never know the world she had come from. And that voice, steadfast, tender, unshaken, had become the heart of a family, the breath of a new legacy. The courage to be seen had changed everything, and it had lasted. Some stories don't end with a kiss under the stars or a final waltz in a ballroom. They live on in the quiet choices we make, in the courage to rise when the world looks away, and in the strength it takes to love without conditions. Susie's journey was never about gowns or titles. It was about being seen, truly seen, for the soul she carried. And Harrison, once blind to his own heart, learned that love isn't inherited through wealth, but earned through truth. We hope this story touched your heart the way it touched ours. If it made you feel, think, or dream, even for a moment, leave the word light in the comments. It helps us know you were here until the very end, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances and in love that defies expectation. And don't forget to check the cards on the screen. We've left you other timeless stories that speak to the soul, just like this one. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for keeping these stories alive.